Hello, this is the front-end web development class. My name is Jeffrey. We're going to start on our recap. For the last few weeks, we've talked about different parts of CSS. Last week, we talked about floating and flexbox, and prior to that, we talked about positioning. We're going to talk about a few sort of assorted aspects of more recent. Well, flexbox is very recent, but other recent changes or recent additions or new features in CSS that kind of make it a more powerful, more useful, styling language for the web. But before we do that, we got a half-hour recap of just stuff we talked about earlier. I might as well go ahead and show the final little stuff that we did in the last two classes, just to show a few general concepts in CSS. So previous classes, let's start with positioning. If you want to follow along, you can go to the front-end web development page, go down to the previous classes there, and follow the links to the lecture materials for CSS positioning. Or you can just go straight to Jeffrey FWD on GitHub. And I think there's a new wonderful green button that allows you to download a zip file or open it up using GitHub Desktop or just clone the repository. So the big green button will allow you to get this content one way or another. So you can go ahead and download the whole thing if you feel like. And once you've done that, go ahead and unzip it or clone it or whatever you got to do. And I'm just going to jump in there. FWD, Series 9. What was that? Class 15? Right. So here's what we worked on for Class 15. We have this silly-looking little grocery magazine thing, grocery coupon book, whatever you want to call it. And what's special about this page is that it's got a lot of things that are sort of arbitrarily positioned in different parts of the page. This grand reopening seems to be kind of floating around in space. This picture of cheese is in the lower left corner of this box. Picture of chicken is in the upper left. This is also in the upper left, and this bread seems to be completely centered. Same with the prices and the titles. They're just in different areas. Prior to teaching this class, we really knew how to stack things on top of one another, maybe distance themselves from the side of the page or from one another by using margin, add a little bit of padding in between, within each box using padding, add borders, add background colors, do that sort of stuff. That was our box model introduction. But with positioning, we've learned about how to make a more sort of two-dimensional website. Actually, we can call it three-dimensional website in some cases. Let's talk about that. First of all, let's inspect this guy here, this grand reopening. As we can see in our HTML here, there is an H1, heading 1, and an H2. Grand reopening, H2 class reopening. What's going on here is that even though it comes after Ned's Grocery in the code, it seems to be kind of coming before it, or at least to the left of it. What's going on here is that we're using the position absolute property, which is changing it from something like this, which is the big heading that stretches across the whole page, to something that's more like this, where we can use properties like left and top to put it in a specific place. These little left and top properties are offset properties that specify that this is 100 pixels from the left of something, and this is 0 pixels from the top of something. What is that something? In this case, it's the body. We know that because the body has a position of relative. So a combination of position absolute and a position of relative will allow any element inside this relative container, actually including the relative container itself, to be offset from that origin point using top, right, bottom, left offset properties. So this is 0 pixels from the top of body, as we can see, and it's 100 pixels from the left of body. Cool. So same stuff applies to the rest of this page. We now that we know about floats and flexbox, because of last week's class, you should now kind of understand that what we did with this class is a little strange. That is to say, each one of these list items is aligned to a specific corner of this larger unordered list. This unordered list has a height of 600, and it has an inherent width of 960. But if we were to simply float and clearfix these things or use Flexbox, this container would simply stretch itself out based on what its content is. Not so with position absolute elements, which when absolutely positioned do not affect the size or the placement or the stacking order or anything of other elements on the page. That is to say, once you position something absolutely, the rest of the page acts as if it doesn't exist. So how do we get these things so neatly aligned right next to each other? Well, we did that with a bit of work. Specifically, every list item has a height of 300 and a width of 480. So each one of these is 300 by 480. Next up, this thing with the class of cheese is in the upper left. This thing with the class of chicken is in the upper right because it's got a top of 0 and a right of 0. This one called fruit has a bottom of 0, so it's now down 0 from the bottom of its UL, which has a position of relative. And this bread has a bottom of 0 and a right of 0, which means it's in the lower right corner of the UL. So what I'm getting at is that the fact that the cheese and the chicken are sitting flush right next to each other is kind of a coincidence. It just happens to be that they're exactly 1/4 the size of this UL, and positioned in each corner, it means that they line up. That's very kind of weird and a strange way of doing things, but it is possible. A better example of using absolute positioning is moving stuff into the corners of well, things that actually need to be moved in the corners, such as this cheese, this image of cheese, and the price are all in different corners, and they're not really affecting the placement of one another. That's because the rule is that inside any element that is the direct child of any list item on this page is absolutely positioned. So that means that each one of these guys is not going to affect the placement of one another. Price, image, heading, price, image, heading, price, image, heading. You can even stack stuff on top of one another and they won't conflict, at least on the x-axis, y-axis standpoint. But I talked about how position allows you to position things three-dimensionally, so we also need to talk about z-index really quickly. Z is referring to the z-axis. You got the y-axis, which is vertical, x-axis is horizontal, and the z-axis, which is depth. The higher the z-index, the more on top of everything an element is. So given that this thing has a position of absolute and a z-index of 1, that means that it's going to sit on top of anything else, including this image of chicken and the price. The z-index is important because if we get rid of it, see what happens? Assorted fruit becomes just fruit. Bread disappears. Chicken becomes kin because it's kind of behind the image of the chicken. Why are they behind it? It's simply because the image tag comes after the H2, so it has this natural Z stacking order that's above it. But you give anything a Z index, and all of a sudden it's on top of everything else. If you wanted to put something on top of this, you could give something that's a sibling of it a Z index of 2, and it would be above that. So you just keep incrementing your Z indexes. I didn't mention this in previous classes, but a good rule of thumb with Z index is that it's good to comment in your CSS why something has a specific Z index, what you're trying to position it on top of, because you will easily forget. And then you'll go like, why did I give this thing a Z index of 45? Oh, it's because it has to sit on top of these other 44 elements, right? So that's why I would just recommend commenting that so you don't forget and so you don't accidentally put something underneath something else when you start making a lot of changes to different parts of your code. Okay, so that's generally how absolutely positioned stuff works. It just allows you to use offsets to position stuff pretty much anywhere you want relative to the certain corner of whatever its container is, relative container is. Yeah, so there's that. Any questions about this? Pretty much makes sense. Then we can move on to what we talked about last week. If you want to skip over to, if you downloaded the stuff, then you can go to class 16. So we talked about this mock-up here, or this website. Here's my radical website. It looks kind of silly, but the magic about this website is that it's got multiple columns. It has things aligned to the left, things aligned to the right. If you wanted to be a masochist, you could do this with absolute positioning, like I just showed with that previous site. But in this case, the good thing about what we've got here is that the width of this sidebar affects where this main container shows up. The width of this main container affects where the sidebar shows up. We're using horizontal stacking, using floating to have certain things sit to the right or to the left of one another versus on top of one another vertically. So, that allows us to have this little box in the corner here, box in the right over here. Something worth knowing, which I mentioned last week, is that floated elements act in many ways like position absolute elements. You can't use offset rules to position them in different places, but when you set something to floated, almost every other element on the page acts as if it's not there. For example, we have this heading, My Radical Website. As you can see, when I highlight this heading, you'll see that it stretches all the way across. In fact, these two callout divs seem to be overlapped by My Radical Website. That's what's happening. My Radical Website, being a non-floated, just regular element, is acting as if these floated elements just don't exist. So the only elements that acknowledge floated elements are other floated elements. So only floats can really interact with one another, whereas other elements cannot. And that includes containers. This header is yay wide because it's got the heading inside it. But if we got rid of this heading, this header would have a height, it would have a height only of 40 because that's what the padding is. See, 20 pixels on all four sides, 20, 20, 20, 20, it's 40. 40 vertically, 40 horizontally. But these callouts are not stretching it out. You'll see that they're actually kind of sitting, kind of popping outside of it, which is what floated elements do. They simply pop out of their containers if their containers aren't set up properly to sort of accommodate for their height. You have a question? Yeah?
In all of the elements you're talking about floating containers, anything, is there any system to label the elements with any given element? What's above me, what's below me, what's to the left, what's to the right, and so on for each element?
Why would you want to do that specifically?
I'm just used to doing that with Android. And
with what?
Android.
Oh.
If their XML layout, you can label what's to the left, what's to the right, so that if everything is moving, it kind of stays the same way.
Well, that's kind of what XML does. Obviously, as you can see here, this callout comes before this callout. This callout comes before this heading. These are inside this header. So it's not like every element knows specifically what its previous node or next node or whatever is. You can, from a programmatic standpoint, from JavaScript, you can certainly find that out. But with CSS, you usually don't really have to. It's really, in CSS, you really only have to worry, in most cases, about what that element is. And based on how you write your CSS, to float certain things, not float certain things, and then how you lay those elements out in your HTML, that kind of works together where you have control over what comes after what and how things render based on what CSS you've written. So hope that kind of makes sense. I don't know.
Just a different system.
Yeah, it's kind of different. So this is another example here where we've got, inside this container div, we have an aside, main, and another aside. Now, each one of these asides and mains is floated to the left, so they're stacking horizontally. Asides have a width of 200, and mains have a width of 600. Now, interestingly enough, you might notice that these asides don't have any properties here that give them a background color of orange. So why are they showing up as orange? The reason is because these asides are not orange, they're transparent. It's the container that's orange. The container that contains all three of these elements is orange. And it just so happens that because this main is the longest element, that you don't see any orange underneath or anywhere like, underneath this main specifically. So the main, which is white, is sitting on top of the big orange container, whereas these asides are transparent. Why am I talking about this? Well, as you can see over here, as I hover this right aside, you'll see that the highlight only goes so far down. If, for example, I gave asides a background of orange, and I didn't give a background of orange to the container, look at what would happen. You see how the orange doesn't go all the way down? That's because these three floated elements don't stretch out to be the same height as one another. They're only as tall as the stuff inside them. That's just how elements work in general, unless you give them an explicit height, which we don't want to do. You can actually give them a min height. That might be nice. But either way, what I'm getting at is the way that we were able to get this nice sort of rectangular layout rather than like box 1, box 2, box 3 is by giving the container a background of orange. Now that makes some sense. But the problem is, though, that remember I said earlier that a container that contains floated elements does not stretch out to contain those things? Remember what happened when we got rid of My Radical Website? This whole thing kind of just collapsed. And these two floated items did not did not seem to affect the height of this element. Well, then how can it be that this container with 3 elements inside it has, that they are affecting the height of this container, that this container is exactly the height of the tallest element inside it, which is this main? Well, we're using some sort of special mix of rules, mix of properties called clearfix. The most important part is that this clearfix class that we're adding here, CF, adds a little thing called a pseudo element to the end of this container. This does not actually appear in our HTML. If you were to view source, you wouldn't see anything like : : after. What's happening here is that the CSS has a little rule saying that we'd like to put a fake element at the end of this container, as the very last child of this container. And we want to apply some rules to it, specifically clear both. Clear is a rule that, if applied to an element, such as this heading over here, will fall underneath any floated stuff that comes before it. For example, this figure is floated to the right. And like I said, any floated element with any sort of element following after it, the element won't treat it as if it's there, unless you set a clear of right, which drops it underneath it. So if I didn't have a clear of right, you'd see that this heading is up there, and it's sort of just overlapping this Tom Selleck guy here. But since we added a clear of right to this heading, it's dropping underneath it. It's acting as if it understands that it's there. So what clearfix does is it creates a fake element that's actually not in the HTML, a pseudo element, if you will, that has that same property, clear of both. And because this clear both element is down at the bottom, and the container wants to stretch to contain all of its elements, the fact that it's underneath all of the floated elements means that the container is going to stretch out so it can reach down to the pseudo element at the bottom, which in turn stretches out the container, even though it contains only floated elements. So that's a little trick that we use. And I didn't really get into the specifics of how to write clearfix. Usually people use some sort of helper library that comes with a clearfix class or a clearfix mixin if you're using Sass, or you just search clearfix and this nice little clearfix hack. Oh, this is actually a different info box than I've seen. Let's see. No, 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 wrong. No, no, where is that? Micro clearfix hack is a lot better. I like this guy a whole lot more because it makes a lot more sense. But as you can see, I guess there are different ways of doing it. This one is very verbose. Yeah, whatever. I would probably just go with this one. This has always served me well. The micro clearfix hack. All you really need is these 2 rules here, just 3 CSS properties, and you're good. So that's what I'd recommend. So finally, in addition to floating, we also talked about Flexbox. What we did was we recreated this site using Flexbox instead of floating. As you can see, I think it's pretty much the exact same thing. Going back and forth. Wait, it zoomed in? Oh, I zoomed out. Huh. Oh, things are a little different, Okay. But either way, mostly the same. So let's talk about Flexbox, how we got this to work. The way that Flexbox works is that you have the idea of a container and you have items inside it. So container with items, right? In fact, in this case, we have an element with a class of container, and it has 3 items inside it: aside, main, and aside, right? What we did here is we said that this container has a display of flex. And what that does is it allows items within it to be aligned along a certain axis. Now that axis is up to you. It can be horizontal, it can be vertical, it can be upwards, and it can be right to left. So it can go in 4 directions: row, row reverse, column, or column reverse. That's what they're called. And depending on the direction you choose, the default is row. So you give flex and all of a sudden things align left to right. You don't need to float these guys. You don't need to say this is float left, this is float left, this is float left. You don't need to worry about the container stretching to contain everything, since it'll just do that by default. So in other words, it's a lot simpler. You just say display flex, and all of a sudden stuff inside it goes from left to right instead of from top to bottom. There are a lot of different sorts of things. Let's see here. So this guy is also a flex container. We said that headers display flex. We also said that justify content space between. This is part of the flex specification that specifically says that that the items inside this header, remember we have 3 of them, call out number 1, call out number 2, call out number 3, there should be space in between them. they shouldn't simply stack right next to each other, sitting one after another. They should be equally distributed throughout the box. No space around them. Like this should be all the way at the left, this should be all the way at the right. Sorry. And there should only be space in between them. By the way, the space that you do see is because this header has padding. But there's that. In addition, you might notice that as I go 1, 2, you'll see that it goes all the way to the right, and this goes to the middle. Why do the elements seem sort of out of order? Why is it that I highlight 1, 2, 3, and it seems to go 1, 3, 2? That's because I gave each one of these an order property. Order is another part of the Flexbox spec that allows you, within a Flex container like this header, to specify the order in which certain things render from left to right in the Flexbox. So, for example, this best callout has an order of 1. This swell callout has an order of 3, and this header h1 has an order of 2. So 1, 3, 2, or 1, 2, 3. There you go. That's why they're out of order. So you can very easily arrange these things, and that makes it so you don't have to change your HTML in order to get your in order to use CSS the way you want to get certain stuff on top of one another or to the right of one another or whatever else. This makes it so both of these callouts can sit right next to each other, and then the heading can go after it because you just from a readability, from a content standpoint, you probably want those two callouts to sit right next to each other. So that's one cool thing. There are a whole bunch of other Flexbox properties. I use this guide so often that Google auto completes it for me. But there are a whole bunch of different properties you can use. There are properties for the parent, the Flex container, and the properties for the children, Flex items. So as you can see here, so things like display Flex, order 1, 2, 3, -1, whatever you want to do. Flex direction, that can change whether you want stuff to be going from left to right, which is the default, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. Why would you want to do top to bottom if that's kind of just the way that HTML works? Like by default, items stack on top of each other. So why would you even really need a flex direction of column? Well, think of it this way. Let's say that this header was really tall, that it had a height of 500. And instead of having a flex direction of row, we had a flex direction of column. Oops. Column. What happened? Where'd my height go? Hello? Hello? There we go. For some reason, it disappeared. Let me try that again. Flex direction column. Well, things don't seem to be going in the flex direction that I gave to them. In fact, the rules seem to be disappearing before my eyes. Not really sure why that is. Let me try this again. Flex direction column. And height 500 px. Okay, there we go. So as you can see here, we've got item number 1, item number 2, item number 3. Now, you'll notice that they're spaced out because we use that property justify content space between. So we didn't just justify content space between. It would just be like 1, 2, 3, and this could be something that you could accomplish with just basic HTML, right? Or basic CSS. You just say item number 1, item number 2, or well, item number 3. Well, they're still in the different order that I gave them, so that's still a thing. Once you use justify content, you can get it so my radical website appears right there in the vertical center. And vertical centering is something that's very hard to do without the use of Flexbox. It's possible but hard. With Flexbox, it makes it really easy. You simply say that this thing has a flex direction of column, that it has a justified content space between, and the middlemost element, or the only element if you want, will be right there in the center. So that's pretty cool. If it's one item, you might need to do space around instead of space between. Either way, so that's pretty cool. You can have stuff sort of distribute themselves out evenly from a vertical standpoint, which has pretty much been up near impossible without Flexbox. There are other sort of hacky ways of doing it, using table display instead of regular block display, but I wouldn't recommend doing any of that. Yeah, so that's some cool parts about Flexbox. And last class we pretty much talked about floats for a whole hour, and then only had to talk about Flexbox for like 20 minutes because it's very easy to approach, very easy to use. The only downside, and we'll talk about this more today, is the fact that it doesn't work in every browser that's out there. So the reason I keep teaching floats is because, well, they have their use. Text can only wrap around floated elements, which is kind of cool. But another reason is because if you want to make a website that works for a very large worldwide audience of people who don't necessarily all use the latest browser, which is not always necessarily their fault, you might want to use floating instead of Flexbox because it's more broadly supported. That said, a site like Can I Use, which I showed last time, I'll probably use again this time, says specifically what percentage of browsers support it. So in this case, unprefixed and prefixed, 94.04. Oh, that is, I'm sorry, this is full support and partial support. If you count partial support, then 94% of browsers support it. Unprefixed, that is to say without any additional weird properties that we'll talk about, vendor prefixes, 80% do. Now that sounds pretty good, 94%, but that is 6% of the world that you're leaving behind. And you might not want to do that. You know, in some cases, you might legally not be allowed to do that, you know, because you might be making a site, like a government site that goes, like, my wife Anna works for UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley has a rule that all of their sites must be accessible. Not that they must be rendered in Flexbox or anything, but that they must be accessible. So maybe you might be making a page that doesn't gracefully degrade, which we'll also talk about today, where since you're depending on some sort of more modern rule that older browsers don't support, the site might not render or just might not look usable in an older browser. So that's stuff that you need to kind of have to be on the lookout for. Anyway, you know, if you don't care about that, you don't care about older versions of IE, or you're developing for a market like for only mobile phones or something like that, then it's close to 100% of browsers that support this. So you should just be able to do that. You know, just use it. Yeah, cool. So there's that. Any questions? I've been talking a lot and doing a lot of recapping. All right. See if I have any questions online. Nope, no viewers. Okay. Cool. What else can I talk about? Nah. What I will say, and we're going to remedy this in a few minutes, is that this design, be it Flexbox or Float, only really works for a minority of browsers. When I say minority of browsers, I'm referring to the fact that there are billions and billions of smartphones out there, and the amount of desktop computers that are out there is diminishing. There are fewer people using desktop computers every day, and more people using phones, and to a certain extent using tablets, which means that this site won't render very well on a phone because it'll look very small, and you'll have to zoom in to pan around the site. So, you know, I talk about Flexbox and I talk about floating, but you know, in the glorious future, which we'll talk about very soon, or not the future, but the present, really, the majority of devices don't really benefit from a big 3-column layout like what we have here. As you probably noticed, if you tried to use your phone and look at a site that has 3 columns, you've had to pan left and right using your finger, swiping all over the place to be able to see the entire thing, or zooming in and zooming out again. Not a very fun experience. So today's class kind of talks about remedying that if you have a design that uses some sort of wide layout like we've got here. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I usually give it until exactly 8 p.m. until we start our new stuff. So, little moment of zen.
This is another
Yes.
question, but this, the noise bridge page that you created, so the powered by
MediaWiki, yes. Mm-hmm.
do you have to write it in PHP?
Well, MediaWiki runs in PHP. The app itself, MediaWiki, is a PHP-based application. But in order to edit a page, you don't need to know PHP. You only really need to know MediaWiki syntax. The page itself looks mostly like HTML. There's a whole bunch of elements here. There are some cases, some weird little situations here, and in a few other places, like with brackets and hashes and other stuff, that look a little strange. Essentially, this is a mix of HTML and MediaWiki syntax. It's the same syntax that you'll see on Wikipedia and a whole bunch of other ones. Wikipedia also runs on MediaWiki as well. So, you know, there's that. So that is to say, one of the most popular websites in the world runs on PHP. It's a shame, that's how it works. Anyway, to edit something like this, you definitely don't need PHP. There's no PHP here. There's no interactivity on this site beyond what MediaWiki provides to you, which is not much. But the reason that this looks the way that it does versus the way that the main page looks versus what a simple page like this looks is that I have administrator privileges that allow me to go in to the main CSS file that of Noisebridge's wiki and style certain pages the way that I want them to be. The way that this works is that let's take a look at the body tag. You'll see that the body tag has a class of page front-end web development here. In fact, every page on any MediaWiki site has a class whose title is a class containing the title of the page. So knowing that, as long as that is page front-end web development, I can go ahead and say, if the page is, dot page front-end web development space, everything inside here should look different. So that's kind of how I make it look so classy, that's kind of a pun, whereas other parts of the page, other parts of the site are not like that. So it's all just using CSS to sort of make it the way it is. Yeah.
It's kind of established as a principle of, for a given page, one file for JavaScript, one file for CSS, and one for HTML.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a favorite way to do it when we were doing it.
Well, yeah, that's because we were making single page websites for the most part. I would say that if you're making a large site, that the easiest way essentially to get to navigate throughout your page is usually to have a single JavaScript file that serves your entire site. That sounds like it might be a little bulky and a little bit too much wasted code, but you really can't know necessarily where a user is going to navigate to. You could split out your behavior so you have only little bits of JavaScript that support the current page that you're on, but you might also want to have some sort of base layer that is on every page that deals with all of the shared components. When it really comes down to it, though, every page that you go to means it's another JavaScript, another CSS file that has to load. And wouldn't it be nice that if somebody goes to the main page and then navigates to subsequent pages, that the only file that they need to load up is HTML, that they already have all the CSS and JavaScript that supports that page. So it's really a trade-off between the file size of the CSS and the JavaScript you're loading versus the amount of requests that the browser has to take for every subsequent page that loads. So I would say that that it's probably a good idea to write a single JavaScript file and a single CSS file for a full site. That might make it slightly difficult to maintain, though, because if you need to edit some behavior for a certain page, you need to find in a very large JavaScript file where that behavior is. And that's why there are certain systems that can go ahead and concatenate a large amount of JavaScript files into a single package when you're all done with it. So the development aspect versus the actual production aspect can be very different, the whole environment. I've taught in the class before something like HARP, or other sorts of preprocessors that allow you to deal with these sorts of things and then eventually end up with a nice tightly packaged site where you've got one JavaScript file, one CSS file.
So is there anything in CSS and JavaScript or HTML, if you've got one large file and you have different people, you don't want to foster administrative privilege, you don't want one administrative privilege to cover the other one's code?
Well, you shouldn't be writing anything in your JavaScript files that have any privilege information that other people shouldn't see. That sort of information, any sort of privilege information, user-specific information, should not be embedded into your JavaScript or your CSS. Your JavaScript should be making requests, or your HTML that loads should contain data that is specific to that specific user. So, you know, like all the behavior can be downloaded. Not all the behavior will necessarily, you know, be applicable for every user. But the way that you write it and the way that you get other signals from the site, such as what data is embedded into the HTML or what data you get from certain AJAX requests, that can inform how the JavaScript runs and what specifically it displays for every user.
I was no arguing with that for users there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about developers access change sections of code.
Uh-huh.
It would seem that the only way on a larger branching site like this one to keep the informed, which is to keep the developer separate, because you have to make 3 separate files. So when you go to that page, you have to reload those, that HTML, CSS, and that JavaScript file.
Well, every page will have separate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Either 3 or more files. But what I'm trying to get at is that for a developer versus an actual user of a site, the developer might have an entirely separate environment where the page loads up very different looking, very separate JavaScript files, whereas once it's all packaged and ready for release, it turns into a single bundle or 3 bundles, that is, of HTML. Well, per page, it's a lot of different HTML files, and then a bundle of CSS and a bundle of JavaScript, which has been minified, concatenated, and is a lot less fun to navigate or change around because it's only really meant for speed and meant to be delivered as one big blob. So there are automated systems that you can put in place to change your development JavaScript into production JavaScript. I need to continue on with the class, but those are good questions. So we can talk about that more in lab or whatever else. Okay, so let's talk about new stuff. Hi, this is the front-end web development class. We're going to talk about modern CSS today. Modern CSS is essentially just an umbrella term. I used to call this class CSS3. I used to have a class on progressive enhancement. I used to have a class on media queries and mobile and responsive design. But all these concepts can really kind of be bundled into one sort of concept, one sort of bigger idea of just how CSS is used now, what people like to do, some common techniques that people like to do. As I was saying earlier, we took a look at this class, this site last time. This is a pretty ugly looking site, but the most important glaring aspect of it is that if we were to resize this screen to around here, we'd have to navigate back and forth to see the entire thing. That's not very fun. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and open up Simulator. Simulator is a program that comes with Xcode. If you have Mac OS and you want to download Xcode and install Xcode, you can go ahead and just run Simulator. And what you'll have is a simulation of iOS for an iPhone. Even if you don't own an iPhone, you can still simulate what it acts like if you've got a Mac computer. So I'm going to open up this page in Safari. This is my company's page. Let's go over to here. So as you can see, this is what it loads up like by default. It's all zoomed out. And I'm sure you've been to a multitude of websites that are like this, where the first thing you do is, in order to read something, you double-click and you zoom in. Not good enough. Double-click, zoom in. Not good. Nope, can't do it. What about pinching to zoom? Oh, I can't even fake pinching to zoom on this thing. So not very good. Oh, there we go. Now I can read everything kind of. I only have to pan back and forth to read every single line. Maybe I want to like rotate it, so I can read it a little bit better. Now everything's even bigger and I have to zoom out. So not great, right? Not a very good experience. The fact is that you should be making websites for mobile devices. And then loading it on a larger desktop display should be an afterthought, relatively. That is to say, it's that your approach to designing a website, or maybe not your approach, but your designer's approach, if you're the developer, you should tell this to any designers that you work with, that their approach to designing a website should be that it is for mobile devices, because mobile devices are the primary way that people use the internet today. This was not the case just a few years ago, but it is now. And designing a website primarily for desktop versus for mobile is backwards. You really should be doing it mobile first. So that's one term that people use very often, mobile first, to say, make your website accessible by a mobile device, and then add additional features on top or additional CSS on top that makes it render, more horizontally, if you will, on a desktop display. That's just how things should work. That said, what we'd like to do is take a website like this 3-panel thing and turn it into something that will be mobile first. We're going to relegate all of the width and floating and whatever rules to a little part of our CSS that only loads up if the screen is wide enough to support it. So what I'd like you to do is download this page here. We'll start on this page and make it mobile. If you want to go and, this is it, link right there, this page. Go to front-end web development, the wiki page, and scroll on down and download this page. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder like I always do. If you've downloaded the class materials, I would recommend, as I do every week, not to create a folder inside the class materials that you've downloaded. If you haven't already, I recommend that you create a separate directory on your computer where you can work on all these class materials on your own that don't affect the files here. So don't put them in FWD, don't put them in Series 9, create your own separate folder and do whatever you want in there. I would recommend creating a new folder for every class that you attend or every project that you work on, just to keep things nice and organized. So I've created class 17. I'm going to go ahead and open up this little blog zip file. And let's see what's inside it. Got this guy, my blog. Looks like a blog site. It's got a little site map down at the bottom. It's got a search bar and some posts on the side. Got a nav bar on the top. And there you go, right? So it's got a JavaScript file. I don't think this JavaScript file really has anything inside it. Oh, it does, but maybe we might or might not use that. And then the CSS file. Let's go ahead and just copy these 3 guys into the new folder that we created for this class. Class 17. Okay, so site looks fine. It's navigable. It's readable. The cardinal sin, of course, is that if we were to resize this window, it wouldn't look very good. We're only reading half of the content here, right? There's the other half. So not good. Yeah, let's fix that. What I'd like to do is open up our CSS file in our text editor. Oops, one second. I'm actually going to open up this entire folder here. So if you can navigate to this folder here, or the folder that you created, and just open up all the files over here on the left, index.html, style.css. It's pretty easy. You just go to File, Open, find the folder that you store stuff into, and just press the Open button, not on a specific file, but just press Open, and it'll pop up this little sidebar navigator on the left. That'll happen in Sublime, Atom, Brackets, maybe a few other ones. So, pretty straightforward CSS. I wrote the CSS a little while ago, so maybe I do it a little different nowadays, but it's serviceable, it's usable, and there we go. The HTML is pretty straightforward. We have a header, we've got a nav element, which contains an unordered list of items that you can navigate to. We have a wrapper around the page, an article tag, a header tag inside the article. Article tags are used for things like blog posts or tweets or Facebook posts or comments or news articles or any sort of thing that can sort of be syndicated, has an author, time and date, that sort of thing. And then we got a footer with a sitemap inside it with another nav. Yep. So pretty straightforward. And then some tags at the bottom. So that's cool. Let's start looking at the CSS here and see what specifically we want to change. This is what I would like. It would be really great if this site rendered the way it did here, but if the window were narrower, that certain things that were horizontally aligned, like this article and this sidebar here, were actually vertically aligned, like one thing on the top of another. You should think about, and you and your designer should think about the layout of a page as what goes logically one after another. Would it make sense for this search bar, this little thing, to go above the article or below the article? I would say, since your eyeballs read from left to right, because you're, probably all English-speaking and reading people, that whatever's on the left goes first, and then whatever's on the right goes next. And so, with limited screen real estate, it would make sense that this sidebar is no longer a sidebar; it's simply a little bar that goes underneath the article instead of to the right of it. So, let's go ahead and do that. Now, at what point do we want this to start happening? My thought would be at whatever point you have to start scrolling to see the page. See this little scroll bar show up at the bottom of the screen once I start making this a little bit too narrow? You should never, ever, ever, ever have to scroll in two directions. Unless you're using a spreadsheet, you should not have to scroll both vertically and horizontally. Only one, not the other. In most cases, you probably want it to be vertical. So the fact that I can go to the left and the right here, and top and bottom, that's bad. Don't do that. So at what point specifically does this happen? Let's find out. The easiest way we can find out is by keeping these developer tools open, which will help us out. Even better, when we're dealing with sites like this, we can start to use device mode. Device mode is really cool. You should see this in Chrome. There's a little device button right here, device mode. I'm not sure if it's available in other browsers. I just use Chrome, so there's that. Toggle device mode, and all of a sudden, your screen will not be rendered to the entire viewport. It will be restricted within this little container here. And this container has nice little areas that you can start zooming in and out and everything. Now, this is interesting. What's actually happening here is that the browser is acting as if this is being loaded off a mobile device, which means that the entire page starts to zoom out a little bit, right? Because if you were to load this on a phone that had a resolution of 366 by 211, as it says right here, that it would be kind of zoomed out. You'd have to like double click to zoom into stuff, and that's not so great. So that's not great. But you have to start thinking about like at what point does this start to happen? You could like say, oh, right there. But a better idea would be to simply start measuring. Looks like the body specifically is 960 across. Why do I know that? Well, it says it right there. Body 960 by 1103. The body has a padding top of 77, has a margin of 0. Okay. Let's see. What else? So I would assume that at 960 is the point where we want to start changing stuff around, because that's the point at which things start to zoom out, where it becomes really hard to read things, and you have to start scrolling back and forth. Right? Does that make sense? 960? I think so. Or I'm sorry, not 920. Oh, something worth noting. Width is 920, but it starts happening at 960. Why is this? Well, I wrote the CSS for this file before I started using box sizing everywhere. Remember that box sizing border box is a property and value combo that, when used, makes it so padding does not change the width of an item. Rather, the padding simply grows into the item rather than making the item wider than it is. So this body has a width of 920, but it has a padding of 20 on the left and the right. And since I'm not using box sizing border box, the box sizing is actually content box, meaning that width 920 refers to the size of the content, not including any padding or border around it. So when I add a padding of 20, it's actually 920 plus 20 plus 20, since there's padding on the left and the right. So it's actually at 960 that things start to change. So I would consider 960 to be a breakpoint. A breakpoint is simply an arbitrary point that you can define in your CSS at which you want to start changing things around. You can have an infinite number of breakpoints, as many as you need, to start changing stuff around at any given point. Certain CSS frameworks, like Bootstrap or Foundation, come with some built-in breakpoints. points at which they think you might want to start changing things around. They set these breakpoints at specific widths of the page because they know that certain devices, there's a certain point at which like a certain device is no longer a desktop computer. Now it's a tablet. It's no longer a tablet. Now it's a phablet. It's no longer a phablet. Now it's a phone, right? I didn't make up the term phablet. It's a real thing. And so you might want to use those preset breakpoints to say, this is exactly what I want it to look like on a tablet computer. But I would argue that that's some short-sighted thinking. You are not budgeting for the fact that there could be something called a phablet that's more phone than tablet, but still a little bit more. Or like a large phone, like a 6 Plus versus a 6. Or you might have a Pro tablet, which is 12-inch, whereas a laptop is 13-inch. What I'm getting at is that there is an infinite number of resolutions that you should be budgeting for, not just preset breakpoints of desktop, tablet, phone, right? Because there are a lot of devices that are somewhere in between. So I would recommend that if you have the ability to write your own breakpoints to determine at which point certain things should change. So I'm going to say that 960 is one of them, because that's where stuff starts zooming out. This is what I'm going to do. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to create something called a media query. A media query is a new part of CSS. It's relatively new. It's supported in versions IE 9 and above, which is great because that means that if you're using IE 8, then the page will just render like a mobile page, which is not a bad thing. It's just an older browser, so who cares? So the media query looks like this. It's a little weird. Specifically, it's saying that when the media that we're using, that is to say, the media on which this browser has been loaded, is a screen, and only screen, and if that media has a width of 960 pixels or more, at a minimum width of 960, these are some rules that are going to apply. So why do we say screen? Screen is a very popular resolution. Screen refers to pretty much any screen. Desktop screen, mobile phone screen, tablet screen, those are all screens. This is a screen. There are other media, the most popular secondary media is print. So you can actually have a media query that is for print, where if you print out a page, certain CSS applies, and only that CSS applies. So in case you ever try to print out a page and it looks really, really bad on a printer, you can have some specific CSS that makes that page look a lot better, or entirely different if you want, using only CSS. Yeah?
Is there a limit on the number of these media specifications?
There is no limit. You can make as many media queries as you want. Yeah. Yes?
What's with this type of syntax that kind of looks like JavaScript?
Looks like JavaScript. In JavaScript, there are no @ symbols except in ECMAScript 7, where there are new, what are they called, decorators. But this is a part of the CSS spec. There's media.
Parentheses that's thrown.
Yeah, well, there are parentheses in certain parts of the language. I guess there are none here, but if you ever loaded up an image URL using background image, that uses parentheses. Semi-transparent colors, RGBA, those use parentheses as well. Parentheses are available in CSS for sure. Specifically, what we've got here is this little @ rule. @ rules have been around in CSS for a while. There's one called import that allows you to load one CSS file from within another. I would recommend not using it, but it does exist. So this is simply another @ rule called media that with these parameters of screen and a min width of 960, you can start writing some CSS in here that will only apply if this media matches properly, right? So what I'd like to do is add a width of 960, make it so we no longer have a 2-column website. Actually, does that make sense? I think that at a certain level, things look kind of okay, with the width of whatever. I'm not really sure if I want to do that. Another thing that maybe even before I start working on the CSS, one thing that I probably want to fix is the fact that as I make this page a little bit narrower and narrower and narrower, that things zoom out. I don't want them to zoom out. I want every pixel, regardless of the size of the display, to be exactly equal to a pixel on the site. So that is to say, like, this is so many pixels wide. I want that to be exactly that many pixels wide, no longer how large the viewport is. So this is interesting. This rule that I'm talking about, where I don't want the site to zoom out based on how narrow the screen is actually not part of CSS. It's something that you put into your HTML. There's a special meta tag that you put inside your head called the viewport meta tag that says that you want the width of your page to match the width of the device. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's go here, and we're going to add a meta tag here. Meta, meta name viewport content width equals device width. This meta tag is basically saying that we want the viewport's width to be equal to the width of the device. That is to say that if the device is 640 pixels wide, then the actual website should be 640 pixels wide. It shouldn't be zoomed out to try to show more pixels than it can actually show. So this essentially prevents the site from appearing zoomed out by default. It doesn't prevent you from zooming. You can actually change the viewport additionally to prevent zooming entirely. But let's not do that for right now. Width equals device width. Now when I reload the page and I go like this, oh, it's not doing it. Did I save? Or is it still going to do it regardless? Maybe it is. Well, let me see something here. Oh, okay. Yeah, well, if I go away from responsive mode and move to some sort of like actual phone, like an iPhone 6 or an iPhone 5, and set it to 100% scale, you'll see now that regardless of what device I use, oh, it's setting it back to 37, but this is just zooming it out so it fits in the screen. Whoa, and closing developer mode gets rid of that entirely. What I'm getting at, though, is that depending on, regardless of the device that I choose, it only renders as much as it can render. It doesn't try to zoom the page out anymore. I guess responsive mode isn't really representative of how a browser really works. This whole responsive mode sort of thing is a little buggy, maybe. It is relatively new. It's only been in Chrome for maybe the last few versions, so it's gonna get a little bit better. So this whole behavior that we're seeing here isn't actually how it would work on a real phone. And of course, you can't really, on the fly, resize a real phone. What I'm getting at is it should not render and zoom stuff out, or zoom way in. That's weird. Okay, so that said, now we've got it. So if we actually loaded this up on a real device like this guy, let's reload this. So we reload it again. Hello. This is not really agreeing with me, is it? Oh, I'm sorry. This is the wrong site. That's the problem. Class 17. There we go. Nope. It's still zoomed out. What did I do wrong? 1 second. Did I do something wrong? Did I do width equals device width? Should I have done something else? Width something device width? Width equals device width. No, that's correct. I don't need to do initial scale. Oh, maybe I do need to do initial scale 1. Let's try that. Nope. Did I do this correctly? I did. Well, yeah, I got quotes, they match up. I don't really know what's going on, why it's still zoomed out and everything. Maybe it's trying to decide what's best for me. Well, whatever. I'm just going to start writing my CSS, assuming that it's not going to start zoomed out. Because once I start writing my stuff the way I expected to write it, then I won't have this big wide body thing going on. Actually, well, one more second. User scalable. No? Is that going to change anything? Nope, it's not. Well, whatever. I'm going to just assume that it will eventually work. I'm going to start writing my media query stuff. Whatever. Okay. What I wanted to say was, I think that on some sort of big device like the iPad or something, That doesn't make any sense. What are you doing, iPad? There, well, no, it's still way more zoomed in than it should be. Maybe I should just start doing this instead.
Do you not need the only at media screen?
You can do that. The reason that people put only there is to make it so these media queries work in as many browsers as possible. There are some older browsers that are a little less lenient about the syntax, and they want that only thing to be there, or else they won't respect those media queries. So yeah, you can actually just say media screen and, or you could just say media min width 960 and not worry about the actual type of media. But I put only screen and because that will work in the largest amount of different browsers that are out there, just for backwards compatibility reasons, essentially. Okay, so I'm going to stop using that mobile thing because it's kind of broken, and I'm just going to do this instead. What I'd like to do is, at a certain length, start. I don't necessarily need to break down to get rid of 2 columns at this point, because I think 2 columns still works around here. But I think there's a certain point at which I want this this main content to not necessarily take up the entire width of the page. In fact, remember that I set the body to be an explicit width. I said that the body's width is 920, and it's 920 only, regardless of the size of the page. But wouldn't it be nice if it could be 920, but then start getting smaller as the page got a little smaller? Like, what I'm getting at is, couldn't I assign a max width instead of a regular width, saying that it's 960 maximum, or 920 maximum, but it starts to get smaller as the page gets narrower? Yes, I could. And in fact, I don't even need a media query for that just yet. I know I keep like holding off on actually putting stuff inside here, but you'll notice that there's actually a lot of stuff you can do to make your site responsive without actually writing stuff for specific breakpoints or specific media. So up here for body, I'm going to set max width to 920. I don't even need to set this entire media query or anything. I'm just going to change it from width to max width. And let's see what happens when I do that. All right, I reloaded, and check it out. I start to reload the page, and my blog and the nav bar, they start to get a little narrower. Because my blog and nav, the reason that they're as wide as they are is simply because they're inside the body, which has a width of 920. They stretch only as wide as their container. That's what block elements do, which is why they're starting to get a little smaller, because the body is getting smaller, because it's obeying the max width property there. But obviously, that sidebar disappears. So why is that? Where is it going? It's underneath. Well, that's great. That's actually kind of what we want eventually. We do want that sidebar to be underneath it. So that's excellent. But we don't necessarily want it to be there just yet. I want to say that the sidebar sticks around there until, say, around maybe, I don't know, here or whatever. Maybe I will use an arbitrary breakpoint and say something like, maybe it's 640. That's a good place at which people start to say that things should be in a single column. 640. So that, again, that's not a breakpoint that I thought up of. It's a breakpoint that other people use. So it is somewhat arbitrary, and you could finagle that a little bit depending on what you want. But I'm just going to say, let's say 640 is the point at which I want this sidebar to no longer be a sidebar. I want it to be underneath. But somewhere in between 960 and this, sorry, I'm still not writing media queries, I want this main content to start getting a little narrower. That's what I want. So this thing sticks to the left. I want this content to be a little bit narrower. So I'm going to start doing this. How about instead of a width of 680, we say max width 680. No, that's not what I want. Well, as you can see, at 680, below 680, it actually does start getting narrower, and I do like that for sure. But I also, kind of want this to stick around, right? The sidebar on the right. So, what can I do there? Actually, I forget what I could do there. don't know if I actually did this sort of 3 breakpoint thing before. Yes?
Is there a way to kind of insert this over the article and have the text of the article flow around it?
Kind of, not really. You're talking about a right floated element. You're talking about an element that is right floated inside this article where the text can wrap around it. Unfortunately, this is not wrapping. This is not inside this article, and so the text can't really wrap around it.
We can't float over and have the text flow around it.
Well, we're not changing the HTML. We're keeping the HTML as is. So with the HTML as is, no, we can't do that. Yes?
I'm not sure if it's asking the same question, but you set the max width for both of these elements to be, let's say, 960, so that they stay within a minimum here.
Well, sure. I mean, well, the problem is though that even if I do that, even if I say max width so and so, you know, it's going to cause that to drop down to the bottom. I'm trying to remember here. What did I do last time? I don't actually know if I did this last time or if I just decided to start making things smaller or Well, I could do something a little weird and hack. Yes? Yeah.
Something with a weight.
Weight?
Yeah. No.
Weight? Like?
Yeah, I was gonna say. Like a weight, like I'm thinking of something.
Okay. Right. I would say that I haven't prepared for this class properly, and I forget how I actually did this last time. So I'm just going to go ahead and forget about that in-between breakpoint, and just say that at this point it starts becoming a 1-column thing. Yay! But if I do that, if I do say that this is simply going to be like 2-column and then 1 column, what about this interim area where all of a sudden this thing isn't as wide as it was anymore? Because it's got a max width. Well, wouldn't that be as simple as saying no max width or hold on a second. In width, is that it? No, that's not it either. Oh gosh, I think I've forgotten how to do CSS. Yeah, okay, I think this is the point at which we go ahead and get rid of this max width property. Or we say that only at a size of 960 or above does this have a specific width. Anywhere underneath it, it doesn't have a specific width, and it'll just stretch all the way across the page. So it'll look like this. I'm going to say, get rid of this max width guy on article, and move it down into our media query section, where article has a max width of crap. I accidentally copied the wrong thing, and then 680. Okay. Article has a probably doesn't even need to be a max width 680px. Max width doesn't matter because it's still going to be exactly that much. So article width 680, but only if the minimum width of the page is 960 or above. What happens there is at below 960, all of a sudden, it stretches all the way across the page. So now all of a sudden it goes from 2-column to 1-column. Now down here, this guy, it should probably stretch all the way across the page as well. So we're going to say that only at 960 or above does the aside have a width of 180. So I just got rid of width 180 on this aside here. And I'm going to move it down into a little rule inside this media query that says width 180. Yes. Another thing worth noting is that this is still not stretching all the way across. So why is that? Let's inspect this guy and find out. Oops, let me turn off this mobile stuff here. So it looks to me like this aside is down here. It doesn't have any width rules that are applying right now. Width would only apply if we made it bigger, because as you can see here, there's a little property here that says media only screen and min width 960. Aside has a width of 180. But if we go below that, it doesn't. Yet it still doesn't seem to stretch all the way across the page. It has a width of 402.33, which seems pretty arbitrary. Anyone know why that could be? Do we see any property here that could possibly affect the width of this aside? Float. That's correct. When you float something, it makes it so it doesn't stretch all the way across the page. It only takes up as much width as it needs to. So we probably don't want this to float anymore. We probably just want this to be a regular old element, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say that float left only applies at 960 or above. And there we go. Now it's stretching pretty much all the way across, but it seems to have a little bit of spacing on the left there. Let's find out what that spacing is. Looks like that spacing is margin, right? Because we see that orange block on the left there. So, you know, if I was to make this little box model thing a little wider, you'd see that it's got a margin of 20 on the left. Why is that? Because right here we say margin left 20. Why did we add that rule in the first place? Well, when we made this page big, we wanted there to be some space in between the aside and the article. See this space right here? That space right there, that's the margin left of the aside, which is pushing it away from the article. Looks like we don't need that when it's underneath it. So I'm going to move this margin left 20 out of the regular rule and down into the media query rule. Now, when I make the screen narrower, it's lined up on the left and lined up on the right with the thing that goes before it. Now, it would be nice if there was a little bit of space in between this guy here and there, right? So I'm going to say that by default, this aside has a margin top of 20 pixels. Now I could do this two ways. I could create an entirely different media query that only applies for a width below 960. Essentially make something that says media only screen and max width 959, right? I could do that. Or I could just basically say that everything outside of the media query is for mobile and everything inside the media query is for desktop. And I'd like to do it that way because, like I said, mobile first means that this CSS applies to the most widely used kind of display, which is a phone. So what I'm going to do instead of saying, you know, for mobile margin top is 20 and for desktop margin top is 0, I'm going to say for everything margin top is 20, and then I'm simply going to undo it here by saying margin top is 0. So you see the difference? Instead of setting it in two different media queries, it's that the media query, which appears underneath all the other CSS, is essentially undoing that one property. So it didn't work. What did I do wrong? Margin top 20px. Oh, right. So here's a curiosity. Riddle me this. Why is it that when I highlight a side here, that it seems to highlight the article as well? I'm highlighting a side, but it seems to be highlighting this article. Someone tell me why that is? It's very strange. Here's a hint.
Does it have to do with the margin?
Nope, that doesn't have to do with the margin top. Here's a hint. Take a look at the styling for the article. Remember what happens when you float an element. Elements that come after floated elements act as if they're not there. What's actually happening here is that this aside is not being pushed down by this article. is simply being stretched out by the article. It's starting at the exact same place that the article is starting because non-floated elements that come after floated elements act as if they're not there, except for the inline content inside them. So what's actually happening is that this heading inside search is being pushed down a significant amount. You see that the heading actually stretches the entire way across as well, which is very silly because the word search is in it, and search being an inline element is dropping down, or an inline node, essentially, is dropping down underneath the article that comes after it. So it's really strange, really weird stuff, but it's the reason why the margin for this aside doesn't seem to be showing up here. It actually seems to be showing up way up here. See that orange over there? Really weird. So the answer is that this article is floated to the left. We don't need it to float to the left, except if the min width is 960. Sorry, I got a little sniffles. Now we see the space in between them. That's really weird stuff, but there we go. It works. Cool. So, what's up? Let's add a little bit more to this. The site looks pretty good. I would say that at a certain resolution, well, let me show you an example of a site that my company made. Actually, I made this HTML and CSS. This is a site called Affirm. They allow you to pay for things over time because you can't pay for it. It's credit, essentially. But here's the mobile version. As you can see, at a certain resolution, all of a sudden, things start to change. Such as, you'll notice here that you got the buy with Affirm for merchants, companies, FAQs, sign in. But once you drop down a certain resolution, all of a sudden it just becomes menu. This little icon here, you've probably seen it all over the place. This is what we affectionately call the hamburger menu. When you click it, this whole thing pops out. It's mostly CSS, surprisingly enough. What's actually happening here is that when I click this menu button, the only thing that JavaScript is doing is adding a class of menu open to the body. Everything else is done with CSS. The transition, the display of all this stuff, whatever else, all of it is changing only because the class of menu open is occurring. So a whole lot of stuff either appears on the page or moves out of the page, depending on whether menu open is added to the body tag. For example, this whole thing here is the overlay. And the overlay only has a translate x of 0, that is to say it only moves onto the page if it's inside menu open. Otherwise, it moves off to the side if we turn those rules off. So a lot of stuff depends on this menu open class being added to the body. That said, so what I'd like to do here is something kind of similar, not as crazy as that, but I want to make it so when you click on some text that appears, that the menu actually appears. But otherwise, it might be this menu, even though it's only 4 items, it could be more items. It might be a little bit too wide to appear on the page. It might take up a little bit more real estate than screen real estate than we want. So what I'd like to do is make it so this H1 here that says menu, which is inside our nav, which usually has a display of none in our CSS, that is shown. We want to make it so it's shown at a certain resolution. Currently, it's not shown at any resolution. I want to start showing it when. Oh, sorry. Let me reverse that. I only want to show it when we have a screen resolution of 960 or above. So let's take this top nav rule. Here it is on line 42. Get rid of this guy, top nav H1, and put it down here inside our media query. So it only happens. So it only disappears at 960 or above. So check it out. Below 960, all of us have cool. This was something hidden in the HTML that you couldn't see otherwise, but now it's visible, right? So I have a little JavaScript that I already wrote for this site that when you click menu, a class of showNav appears on body, just like on affirm.com. So if we really wanted to, we could do some crazy, weird transitions to get this thing to move onto the page. And you know, given that this is a modern CSS class, maybe we will do that. So that'll be cool. But the first thing that I really want to do is make it so this UL only appears if the body has a class of showMenu or showNav. And if the screen is 960 or above. At 960, I always want to show the nav. But below 960, I only want to show the nav if the body has a class of showNav. Make sense? So let's do that. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is add a, where is this? UL, right. I'm going to add a display of none to top nav UL. It's going to hide the nav. It's just going to hide the list inside the nav, no matter what we do. It's gone, right? Next thing I'm going to do is write a rule down here saying top nav UL display block. Oops. Block. That at 960 or above, the top nav does show up. So now it's shown and it's hidden. Shown and hidden. So just like on the affirm site, we switch from showing the UL to showing the actual menu heading. Yeah?
How would you compare like this way to like using Bootstrap?
Bootstrap does a very similar thing. The difference between Bootstrap and this is that we're writing this CSS and HTML, whereas with Bootstrap, you simply copy and paste it from what they've already written. I'm pretty sure that Bootstrap is doing something extremely similar to what we're doing here. You know, I can actually show you get Bootstrap. Let's look for navs. Components? Navs. Here we go. So navs, pills, justified, disabled, nav bar, default nav bar. So if I start to make this small enough, all of a sudden our nav bar has a little hamburger. And you click it and it opens up. But if I make this page wider, then the nav bar, where's that nav bar? Goes ahead and looks like this, right? So I'm pretty sure that that's just a media query that's basically saying show that hamburger menu or don't. So let's find out how that works. Oops. Navbar, let's inspect this guy here. Whoop. I just docked my dev tools to the right, which actually makes it a little bit easier for me to resize this page, as you can see. So let's see if we can find that navbar again. Let's inspect this guy here. And we'll probably have some sort of property somewhere that actually shows it or hides it. It looks like there's no property that says whether it should be shown or not. So I'm pretty sure that if we make this page wider, we'll see that will appear. Or not. Where's my thing? Maybe it's a container. Navbar header. And this page is really hard to navigate with such a small screen.
It's okay. I'm just wondering if it was like kind of similar.
It is. It is very similar. It's pretty much the same thing. I'm just looking for the rule specifically that makes it disappear. Oh, I'm sorry. It hasn't disappeared. That's the problem.
Some people prefer not using Bootstrap.
Yes, I prefer not using Bootstrap.
Is it like more complicated?
Oh, interesting. Navbar toggle display none. That's weird. this doesn't seem to have any media query stuff around it, so I don't really know why this is display none all of a sudden. Oh, I'm sorry, no, it does. I take that back. Here we go. Media, min width 768. See? So that's specifically what's causing the nav bar toggle, that little hamburger, to disappear. So it's pretty much exactly what we're doing, just at a different breakpoint. So yes, the reason that I write this CSS instead of using Bootstrap is because I'm teaching you guys how to use CSS. Whereas with Bootstrap, you certainly can do all this stuff, but you're being essentially shoehorned in to an existing design written by a whole bunch of other design developers, and you still have full control over your code. You're going to have to probably override a whole bunch of stuff that they're doing for you. So I'm really just trying to teach about how the underlying stuff works, because there will be many, 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 many cases in which you don't want to use Bootstrap because it is too restrictive. It is pretty much prescribing too much of a design and a behavior to you that you don't want to use. So being able to understand how this all works under the hood without the use of Bootstrap makes it so you can go ahead and create your own thing without relying on someone else's library. It makes it just a lot nicer, a lot simpler. Someone else have a question? No? Cool. All right. All right, so we've got a similar thing going on. We don't have the cute hamburger, but we do have menu here. And when you click it, show nav is added. So next thing we need to do is write a rule that makes it so if show nav is on the HTML class, or show nav wherever, it doesn't really matter if it's on HTML or anything. As long as show nav is somewhere near the top, or near the very root of the structure, that the UL inside the top nav actually shows up. So the rule looks like this. I'm going to say show nav top nav UL display block. Check it out. It works.
Was it blocked?
Well, here, by default, the top nav UL has a display of none. But if top nav shows up inside something else that is a class of show nav, then it has a display of block. So having toggled show nav on the HTML element, now this rule applies, where previously it didn't. That's pretty much the exact way that you tie JavaScript and CSS together. There's some CSS that does some very invasive stuff with CSS. Sorry, there's some stuff in JavaScript that does some very invasive stuff with CSS, where you can use jQuery as an example and run the CSS method within jQuery that will cause certain stuff on your page to change color and change height and change whatever else. But I say that that's a mix of concerns. You're giving JavaScript a little bit too much power. You're basically hard coding into JavaScript the specific kinds of colors and sizes and heights and fonts and whatever else that you want the page to change into. I would recommend never doing that. I'd recommend only trying to add or remove certain classes and have the CSS pick up the slack. Have the CSS cause certain stuff to appear and disappear. As you saw on Affirm, I got this really cool behavior to happen by changing a single class on a single element on the entire page. The whole movement, the display of this whole sort of thing, the fact that the entire page kind of shifted off to the left a little bit, all done with a single class change. So I decided that since we're going to be talking about modern CSS for the rest of this thing, we're going to try and essentially redo that entire behavior, because it's going to teach us about how to sort of, move an entire page around, cause stuff to appear on top of other stuff, use a CSS transition to get something on top and animate it on and off the screen. It'll look great.
Why is it that you recommend doing CSS versus jQuery? And also, we used jQuery before to change colors and elements.
Did we?
Yes, there was a button, but we created different buttons. And
Oh, right. In the assignment, yes, that's correct. But you might notice that, well, actually, let me think about this. Did clicking that button cause a class change, or did it cause an actual CSS change? it might have caused a CSS change, which I would say in the real world you don't do. But there are some really narrow use cases in which you might actually want JavaScript to determine what the width or height or color or something might be. Like for example, let's say that a user has gone to their settings and said that their favorite color or their background color or whatever color or something that they want to be represented as is pink. Then that might be the case that from then on, the JavaScript might be responsible for adding the color pink to certain stuff on the page because only the JavaScript knows that that's the user's favorite color. So certain sorts of interactive or user-specific sort of stuff that would be a little bit too difficult to define for every single user in a CSS style sheet might be better generated by or applied to the page using JavaScript. But other than that, I would generally say that, like in the assignment where we change the background color of a page based on which button you clicked, that you don't really focus on using what I essentially taught in that assignment to use the CSS method in jQuery to change the way certain stuff looks on the page, and instead to simply use the add class or remove class methods like we did in this code here to change classes on the page, which in turn change the CSS. The reason for that being that it's a very good idea to separate the concerns. jQuery, that is to say JavaScript, on your page is not meant to affect the presentation of your page. It's meant to affect the interactivity, the interaction of your page. JavaScript is meant to facilitate interaction between the user and the browser, whereas CSS is meant to change how things look. So, conflating those two things, making the JavaScript dependent on how the page looks means that if you change the CSS around, you start to have to change the JavaScript around as well. You start to put style attributes or on-click methods or other sorts of things into your HTML. All of a sudden, your JavaScript becomes very hard to maintain because you change your JavaScript, you have to change your HTML as well. So separating those things out makes it for a much easier to maintain website. So that said, this is what our JavaScript looks like. This function thing actually isn't necessary. So it's only really these three lines here, saying that if you click on the H1 inside the top nav, then find the HTML element and toggle the class of showNav. Add it if it's there, remove it if it's not. Very straightforward. So click this, click this, and showNav appears and doesn't appear, which in turn causes the CSS to show up or not. If I were to use JavaScript to cause this entire thing to happen, I would have to select a number of different elements on the page. I have to select this entire big blue area. I need to select the entire body. I need to select this button, this menu button up here. I need to select this close button up here, and cause them all to move and navigate around and change all their, and use the animate method that jQuery has to move all this stuff around the page. But instead, by changing a single class, I can just write CSS that is toggled when menu open is available. So that's why I like it. Yeah. All right. So I think I kind of made my case. All right. That said, let me dock this to the right as well because that was fun to use. It's easier to resize the whole window there. Cool. All right. Great. So now you got this little thing here, and regardless of how narrow the page is, it looks all right. Well, this doesn't look all right. One thing that we could do is turn off floating of these individual list items here at a certain resolution. What I'm saying here is that the reason that this list item, actually, let me see here. Yeah. The reason these list items are sitting horizontal to one another is because they're floating. Float item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4, not 5. So I don't like this going on here. I'd prefer to simply turn floating off entirely, or that is to say, only apply floating at a width of 960 or above. So top nav UL li, footer nav UL li. Let me go ahead and just copy these two lines here. Copy these two lines, both the selector and this property. I'm going to get rid of this property now. I'm going to go down here and say Here we go. Top nav ULLI, footer nav ULLI. I went ahead and just got rid of float left up there and moved that down into media only screen so and so. Excuse me. So now when I toggle it, they just sit right on top of each other, which obviously works at any resolution. You know, even on a feature phone that's only like 100 pixels wide, it still works just fine, right? And then now it's floated again at that resolution. Great. Okay. What's some final stuff that I want to do here? Looks like this site map. It stacks vertically this way, and then it changes. Oh yeah, the reason that happens, I think, is because oh yeah, right. I said that. Remember that I wrote in that rule that top nav ULLI and footer nav ULLI float to the left only at a certain resolution. So that affected these guys down at the bottom. Here's a list item. Here's a list item. Here's a list item. Here's a about, print, projects, links, contact. Those are each a list item. And so that rule that I wrote that only floats them at 960 or above applied to these guys, and now it's all nice one long vertical list. So essentially, this is what my blog looks like at a mobile resolution. Very usable. Not the prettiest thing in the whole world, but it's certainly a navigable website, right? Okay, so now that we're done with that, we're going to get on to talking about a few other properties of CSS that kind of help us out. This is verging into CSS3 territory. First thing that I want to talk about is something really straightforward, and it's called border radius. Border radius is kind of what people think of when they think of like one of the first new CSS3 features. Well, let me back up and talk about why people use the term CSS3. What does 3 refer to? Is 3 like a version number? It's not so much a version number as it is more of a layer number. People call it cascading style sheets layer 3. Why layer? Because 2 and 1 still apply. All of the rules, or so that is to say, all the properties introduced in CSS 1 and 2 still apply with CSS 3. So you can think of CSS 3 as more of a layer, more of additional properties that have been introduced to the language. And there's also CSS 4, kind of, maybe, but it's really just that people start to introduce more properties to CSS all the time and don't really worry about what version or layer or whatever it's part of. Same with HTML5. HTML5 is a finished spec and everything, but other people consider it to be a living standard where new elements kind of enter the lexicon from time to time because there's a use for it, right? So although HTML5 and CSS3 are popular buzzwords that you should probably put on your resume, they don't necessarily mean anything because they constantly change, and HTML and CSS are kind of living languages. So is JavaScript. JavaScript, the latest version, is now referred to as ECMAScript 2016, but there will be ECMAScript 2017, or ECMAScript 7 or 8, or whatever you want to call them. It keeps, evolving, right? Pardon me. Yes?
Was there a reason to rebrand it away from JavaScript?
It's still called JavaScript. The reason people call it ECMAScript is because that's the standard. JavaScript is a sort of a child language of the ECMAScript standard. Another child language is ActionScript, which comes with Flash. So Flash for a very long time has had ActionScript that people use to sort of program their stuff. So it's funny, if you come from a world of programming Flash, which Google Chrome is actually phasing out and not going to be including with Google Chrome by the end of this year, then you very much know how to write a JavaScript application. They're pretty much like 95% the same language. Yeah?
When you say Google Chrome will not be including it at the end of the year, do you mean that it will certainly not be bundled initially?
Yes. You can still install it, but they're going to make it so by default it doesn't come with it. Because really, the amount of sites that use Flash are very, very minimal. And what I do is I essentially automatically block extensions by default in case except for when I really, really need to use them. Makes it really great. Anyway, yeah, so that's what's happening later. Right. What I want to do is introduce a few properties to you. One thing is I'm going to make this little menu guy here look a little nicer. I'm going to start. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, oh yeah, never mind. Let me take it back. Oh, never mind. Forget I said anything. I'm going to say top nav H1. That's going to select this menu guy here, top nav H1. I'm going to give it a border of 5 pixels solid black. And I'm going to give it a border radius of 20 pixels. Let's see what that border radius does. I'm going to go ahead and actually put these guys side by side so we can see them both at the same time. So check it out. Menu now has this border with it, which is rounded. It's got essentially a 20 pixel circle, a 20 pixel radius circle in all 4 corners. So pretty straightforward. Border radius allows you to create rounded corners. Prior to border radius being part of the CSS spec, you actually had to include a little image of a rounded corner in all 4 corners and position them absolutely or something. And if you zoomed in, you would start seeing the jagged pixel, like, aliasing of the very small rounded rectangle, image that you had to use. It was very stupid. So it's very good that now we have this very easy way of creating a rounded border in CSS. You can even make them make them ellipsoid. You can make it so it's not exactly like a perfect circle rounded, that it's kind of an oval rounding. So it starts to round and then it gets a lot steeper at a certain point. You can make some really interesting shapes with this border radius thing, because all 4 corners can be given a different radius. But I digress. Next thing that I want to do, I want to go ahead and give this menu. Now, I'm going to take the hamburger metaphor and make it literal. I'm going to make it so this thing looks like a real hamburger. I want to have this patty have a bun on the top and the bottom. So it's going to look like this. Actually, I'm going to do this. Okay, so what did I just do? I just added before and after. Now, we saw this in the last class when we talked about pseudo elements. We talked about creating these fake elements that appear at the beginning and end of an element using only CSS. And you can actually see it right here that this H1 now has this little before thing and after thing showing up in this DOM tree, but it hasn't changed our actual HTML file at all. And you can see that there's something they're showing up before the word menu and something showing up after the word menu. What is it? It's a weird looking kind of 10 pixel wide tall thing. Why is it 10 pixel wide? Because it's got a border of 5 pixels on all 4 sides. So 5 plus 5 is 10. And why is it this tall? Because by default, it's kind of the same height as a line. So it's from top to bottom, that's kind of what it is. So as long as you give something a content of something, even a blank content, as long as it's got this content property, these pseudo elements, before and after pseudo elements, show up on your page. If you don't have this content, it doesn't work. Get rid of that, and it's just not going to render. So you need content, even if it's blank, a blank empty string like I put here. Now that we've done this, I want to start positioning these guys wherever I want. I want this before element to be the top bun and the after element to be the bottom bun. So let's do that. I'm going to make top nav h1 before actually, I'm going to make both of them have a position of absolute. And I'm going to make the H1 have a position of relative. And remember, we saw this at the beginning of the class, that making something absolute inside something else that's relative means that you can start moving it around relative to the relatives container. So let's make this top nav H1 before have a top of negative 20 pixels. That is to say, it's going to be 20 pixels above the very top of its container. Remember that when you say top 0, it's going to sit at the very top. Top 10, it's going to sit 10 below the very top. Top negative 20 is actually going to move above the top of its container. So now all of a sudden, we got this little box here, little box guy. That's our before pseudo element. It doesn't really seem to have much of a height anymore. It's only 10 by 10 because of its border. Why doesn't it have a height anymore? Because absolute elements, their height, their width, or whatever is not really dictated by what's around them. So all of a sudden, it's just a sort of a 0 pixel. It's got 0 content. It's 0 by 0, but it's got 10 pixel border or 5 pixel border on all 4 sides. It's just a box, and it's 20 pixels above the container, which is that blue area there. So that menu there, that blue area inside the orange and the yellow, it's 20 pixels above that. We want to have the top nav H1 after have a bottom of negative 20 px. That's going to move this after thing underneath it. Then we want to have the both the before and the after have a left and a right of 0. Stretches them all the way across. If you give absolute positioned elements 2 offsets on the same axis, like left and right or top and bottom, it simply stretches them all the way across. It's kind of the same as doing width 100%, but this is better because in this case, as you saw, without these before and after properties, without these left and right properties, they sort of showed up in weird arbitrary positions horizontally. The before shows up before menu, and the after shows up after menu. And so if we gave it 100%, that after would actually stretch, I think, beyond. Like, let's see what happens if I said, like, width 100%. Yeah, see, it starts there and then it stretches 100% beyond. So we want to give it a left of 0, but we might as well just give it a left and a right of 0, which moves it to the left, moves it to the right, and stretches it across that way, right? So now we've got something that kind of looks like a hamburger. I don't want this menu guy, this actual text menu, to appear. By the way, I thought I'd mention that all this pseudo element stuff that I'm doing right now is not CSS3. This was actually available in CSS2, and so it's available in IE8, I think even IE7. So this can be done everywhere. This is actually some cool stuff. But it's modern CSS regardless because the use of pseudo elements, instead of having to add all these extra divs into your page, makes it so you can write much cleaner HTML and much dirtier CSS. But CSS is meant to be dirty. It's meant to be where all your weird hacks are. So that's what we're kind of doing right here. Speaking about hacks, I'm going to do a hack which is pretty important from time to time. It's called the image replacement hack, but it's also called the visually hidden hack, which is a better term for this case. Visually hidden allows us to move certain content off the page so it doesn't show up, but it's still visual, quote unquote, to things that need it. What I mean by that is, if you've ever, search engines, screen readers, essentially robots that read your page, are going to want to glean some information out of it. If you try to hide a lot of content on your page using display none, those robots are not going to pick it up. They're going to go, oh, that person hid this content for a reason, therefore it's probably not relevant right now, so I'm going to simply skip over it. When CSS was first started to be used in like 2005, 2006, 2007, people started to use display none to hide massive amounts of keywords on their page. But Google wasn't smart enough to know that that stuff was hidden, and so it would index all those keywords, and it would say like, oh wow, this is probably a very important page since it says the word, you know, jewelry 500 times, right? But it was all hidden so the user couldn't actually see it, so they were fooling Google. Google got wisened up really quickly and started to be able to understand CSS rules really quickly. So now, if you hide something using display none, Google's going to skip right over it. Which actually is a good thing because now if you're writing something the right way, there might be a bunch of stuff on the page that you actually don't want to be read or to show up until later on. So using display none on it is great. But in the case of this word menu, we want the element to show up. We want to create a little hamburger icon. But we don't want the word menu to actually appear anymore. Because just like on Affirm, where we've got this nice little hamburger guy, it actually says menu right next to it. Nah, we're just going to create a hamburger because a lot of people know what those mean. They're on a lot of apps now. They're all on a lot of websites. Let's just do that. So couldn't I just go into my HTML and get rid of the word menu? I could do that. I could just get rid of menu. But that would make it a lot more difficult for screen readers or web browsers, search engines to come to this page and read because they want to see, oh, there's a way that you can toggle the menu. There is a menu on the page. They want to see this text. Especially the blind, they want to know that they can find where the menu is, right? So we have to find some sort of in-between spot where it's not shown, but it's still readable. See what I mean? The idea is something called visually hidden. It's very strange looking. Visually hidden. Position absolute, overflow hidden, clip, rectangle, 0, 0, 0, 0. Height, 1 pixel, width 1 pixel. Margin, -1 pixel, padding 0, border 0. Essentially what this is doing is it is imploding the element. Seriously, it is imploding the element. It is causing the element to, I just realized this is not the right one I'm using. Because it's actually going to move, it's actually going to get rid of our hamburger. I just realized that image replacement and visually hidden are two different things. Sorry. This is actually going to cause our box to literally implode. It's going to set it to such a small width and then set its margin to 1px that it'll turn it inside out and you won't see anything. Clipping it to a rectangle of 0, 0, 0, 0 means that it's simply just like so small and clipped that nothing appears. But that's not what we want in this case. In some cases, it is actually what you want. You want certain elements to be visually hidden in this way. But we actually do want the element to render. We want this hamburger stuff going on. We want our top patty and our bottom patty, or sorry, top bun, bottom bun, and our patty. But we just don't want the word menu there. So sorry, instead of visually hidden, I'm going to find the image replacement hack. The image replacement hack looks like this. It's these 3 rules. Text indent 100%, white space no wrap, overflow hidden. What's going on here is imagine a box. Now imagine that you've indented text inside that box by 100% the width of the box. That means that the indent takes up the entire width of the box, and now all of a sudden the text is all the way outside of the box. Next up, overflow hidden means that anything that overflows outside of the box is hidden, right? So we've indented it so it's off to the side. Then we've overflow hidden so you don't see it. Finally, white space no wrap means that it's not going to wrap onto the next line. So the fact that it's been indented all the way to the right, it usually would just go on to the next line, but it's not going to. It's because we say don't wrap, turn off word wrap. So essentially, now you've got a box of arbitrary size or whatever with all of its text content all the way outside of it, just going off into the horizon as far to the right as it needs to go, but you just can't see it because overflow is set to hidden. It's kind of genius, but yes.
You do this instead of marking something like that, something like a dot invisible for.
That's what this, you can do dot invisible. You can say, you can call the class whatever you want, hide text, invisible, whatever you want. But this is the CSS that comes along with that class.
Is the text indent just looking at the element, or is it looking at the whole page to not go off the page?
That's a good question. 100% of width does change from situation to situation. It will at least be the width of the element, if not something outside of it which is wider. So in most cases, I think it is the width of the, but width 100% in both height and width is sort of strange in some circumstances. So I can't exactly answer that question fully, but I think, but either way, it will work. It will be at least 100% of the container, if not something outside of it. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and find this top nav H1 and add these three rules to this guy here. Those three rules, those three properties, sorry, have been added to this rule, top nav H1. All right. So, my pseudo elements disappeared. Why's that? I wonder. It could be, maybe the text indent has actually caused these guys to mess up. What if I set text indent to nothing? No. What if I set overflow to visible? No. What if I set white space to normal? No, none of that. Okay. Well, I don't know what happened. Where are these guys? Oh. Huh. They're still there. They're just not showing up for some reason. That's so odd. Oh, I know why that is. It's because this H1 has an overflow hidden. And its pseudo elements, which are inside it, are outside of it. See what I mean? See what's going on there? The fact is that because this H1 has an overflow hidden, stuff that's inside it that is moved outside of it will not show up. So I'm sort of out of stuff that I can do other than using a much more archaic technique than this text indent with overflow, which is doing this instead. Text indent negative 9999px. That causes the word menu to be rendered all the way over a few blocks down, because it's being indented by that much. It's very rudimentary and very silly, but that's another image replacement technique. Finally, if I want this patty to not be as large, I can basically give this top nav H1 just a height of 0, I guess, you know? And now all of a sudden, I've got what looks like a very flat hamburger.
Is there really any difference between the concept of indenting it off the screen or sliding it off the screen to the right?
That's what I'm doing. So no, there's no difference.
So there's no minus and plus.
Well, I could have done. I don't know. I mean, I don't know why people use minus. I could have used 999 instead, and now it's all the way over there instead of all the way over there. I don't really know why people use negative. I think there might be a reason behind it. So I just do what everyone else does in that case. But yeah. Now, chances are that you're not going to have a 10,000 pixel wide monitor, so you'll never run into this situation. Chances are. I mean, you know, it could happen. But anyway, now we've got a very weird looking hamburger that works as long as you don't click in between it, which, oh, actually, no, yeah, it totally works. Never mind, take it back. And of course, I can make this hamburger something like, let's make it with, I don't know, something cute, 100 pixels. There we go. There's our nice big looking hamburger there. And it opens and closes our stuff. Yes?
Is there any reason that one could not, upon opening the page, establish the width and the height of the screen in a JavaScript or other variable? and then use that in place of -999.
You could, if you were very concerned that something was, like you didn't know if something was going to render off the page or not, or you wanted to show it just off the side of the page, well, an easier way would simply be to absolutely position it and give it like a left of 100% or a right of 100%, which always moves it off the side of the page. But you could use JavaScript. You could essentially get the window width or something, and then set a style property on it that it has a left or a right of that amount, or text indent of that amount. You could do that. Yeah, so that's something in JavaScript. But there are fancier ways in CSS that you can kind of accomplish the same thing as well. So either way. Okay, so weird looking hamburger opens up our guy here. Next thing that I want to do is introduce that CSS transition technique that upon display of this guy, or upon addition of that show nav thing, that this little menu about projects, links, contact slides onto the page. Okay? So the first thing that I want to do is make it so the top nav UL has a position of fixed. So look what happens. With the position of fixed, as I scroll down the page, it's still here. Position of fixed is very much like position absolute, but instead of anchoring itself to some sort of relative container, the container it's anchoring itself to is the window itself. So even as I scroll, it is this far down from the top of the screen. So that's fixed positioning. But you can still hide it. So give it a display of none, and it'll just disappear. Next thing that I want to do is give this position fixed thing a top and a right and a bottom and a left of 0. Great. I've given this UL a top, right, and bottom, left of 0. The only bad part about this is that now I can't click to close it anymore because it's taking up the entire page and I can't click through it. So I'll probably eventually need a little close button inside this thing that allows me to get back to the page, right? Like we have with Affirm, where you click this menu and you can't click through it, but you can click the close button, which closes it, right? But let's not worry about that for a second. Next thing I want to do is give this top nav UL a background of, I don't know, black. There we go. Click it, the entire page goes away, and it's replaced with this guy, right? No matter where we're scrolling on the page, unless we scroll really fast and we get some little inertia movement stuff going on there, it's just there on top of the entire page. I could now use Flexbox to put this guy in the center, put the content in the center. I could basically say top nav, instead of display block, I'm going to say display flex. And now it causes these things to stack horizontally. Maybe I want to say instead of display flex that, well, no, in addition to that flex direction is column. Great, it's column again. And that justify content is space around. Cool. And that finally, that each list item, top nav li, has a text align of center. And bam. Now we've got pretty much what we've got over here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of spaced out from one another. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not exact, but close enough. It's just a few lines of CSS. Display flex, flex direction, justify content, and text align. They're all there in the center. So specifically what's happening is the flex container with the flex direction of column will make item 1, 2, 3, and 4 stack on top of each other. Justify content space around will cause the equal amount of space to be above and below each item. So as you can see, the space above about, there's twice that space between about and projects, that same space between projects and links. same space between links and contact, and then half that space between contact and the stuff below it. So that space around. There you go. So now we've got these guys. We can make them a lot bigger if we want. You know, font size, let's say, I don't know, 30 pixels. Bam. Cool. Looking good. Now, here's the problem. You see it, then you don't. You see it, and then you don't. We want this to gracefully move onto the page. We want it to just slide onto the page, like this guy does. Just whoosh, slide on, right? And then slide off. But the problem is that you click this, it moves over. I want to click the close button, and look at the body class. The body tag. When I click close, immediately when I click close, on the count of three, 1, 2, 3. Well, it doesn't look like it, but trust me, the class immediately goes away. It doesn't wait for the transition to finish. The class immediately goes away. So in this case, if that class were to go away, if I could actually close it again, remember that without show nav, the display is none. So it should immediately disappear. So what's actually going on here? How do we get this thing to still sort of move off the screen even though we got rid of the class? Well, the fact is that this guy, this big overlay here, never actually disappears. If we close it, it's still here. It's over here on the right. Div overlay is way over there. It's just off to the side. It has it always has a display of block at this resolution. It says specifically at a max width of 780 or below, it's going to have a display of block. So why can't we see it right now? That's because it has, let's find this, where is it? Ah, there we go. It has a transform of translate x 100%. What the hell is a transform? Why are we using translate x? Why couldn't we just use position 100% off from the left, right? If we say position absolute and left equals 100%, it should be 100% the width of the thing for the left of the page. So why are we using translate instead? Excuse me. The reason is because the transform property allows you to apply a whole bunch of different transformations to the element whose animation and placement is powered by the GPU instead of the CPU. So what does that mean? Your computer probably has a CPU, central processing unit, and a GPU, a graphical processing unit. Sometimes they're one and the same. But whatever is responsible for rendering really fancy, fast 3D graphics is usually being done in a separate process than all the other sorts of displays on your screen. When you use transform, you can use some special processing power on your computer to make some really graceful, smooth-looking transformations that don't require the browser to relay out the entire screen upon every change. What happens from a performance standpoint is that whenever you move stuff around on the page, when you scroll up and down, when you change the height of something, you change whether something is shown or hidden, the entire page needs to recalculate itself where everything else should be. But when you use transform, that calculation doesn't have to take place. This transformation happens entirely separate from everything else that's happening on the page. It's as if basically like the GPU has stepped in to like cut out a certain part of your screen and decided to pan that around, transform it however it wants, without the rest of your screen really caring what's going on. So that's kind of what's going on with transforms. And not only can you translate x, which is on the x-axis, and y-axis, and even z-axis, or all three, you can translate in a whole bunch of different ways, but you can scale, you can rotate, you can skew, you can apply matrix transformations. If you're at all familiar with any sort of 3D movement, you can accomplish that using the transform property. And what's more, using that along with the transition property allows you to animate any CSS property change. So what this is saying specifically is that any transform property, if the transform property changes, take 0.5 seconds, that is half a second, in an easing Bezier curve, that is to say, in a very sort of ease in and out, like don't just go linear, like 1, 2. Go like 1, 2, you know? Sort of start slow and then end slow. Like rolling a ball, right? It slows down after a while or something. Take 0.5 seconds on a certain Bezier curve to apply that transformation from point A to point B. And again, you can do more than transform. If I wanted to change the color or something, like I could transform from one. I could transition. From one color to another. You know, let's go ahead and do that. Actually, I'm going to say that when the menu is open, the overlay has a transform of translate x0, meaning it's translated from 100% to 0%, meaning it's on the page. But I'm going to give it a background color of red, and then I'm going to close it. Oh, but I didn't animate the color, so I'm going to say that the transition is going to be transform 0.5 SEs, comma, background 0.5 SEs, and now check it out. Whoop! See how it transforms from blue to red in a nice, graceful way? That is the power of the transition property that allows you, as long as some new CSS or class is going to be applied and a new property is applied that changes the value, you can transition between those two values and take as much time as you need to move from point A to point B. And that's what causes these nice little transitions to occur.
Can you change the values on both of them? I'm sure.
I'm sorry?
Can you change the values on both of those?
On both of those whats?
Well, on one of them. So
on one of what?
One of the E's values.
Yes.
So you just have to look the low number and then make one of 15.
Yeah, so I could make it so this background exactly takes 15 seconds to change. Look at that. So yeah, it took 15 seconds to change from blue to red. Yeah, so you can do that. You can even change the easing from, like, there's ease in out, there's linear, there's even, you click this little purple thing and you can change how it works. Isn't that pretty cool?
That's all CSS.
That's all CSS. Yeah.
Is there a dissolve?
Dissolve? You mean to have it fade out?
Because when it fades out, what we do when it fades in?
Yeah, that would be changing the opacity property. So, like, let's say that this guy has an opacity of 1, but by default it has an opacity of 0. If we transition, if we transition, sorry, I'm trying to type in this box, opacity 5S ease, then that means that this guy is going to take 5 seconds to transition from transparent to opaque. See? So yeah, it's not, there's not a fade in or a you know, like a thing. It's just that you're animating or you're transitioning the opacity property. So you can use as many properties as you want. You just comma separate them and then specify a duration and an easing curve, and that's how long it'll take in case any of those properties change. It's pretty cool. Just wait for it to fade out in the background, and bring it back in, and it fades back in, right?
It really adds, like, that just like a little dynamic aspect of it really adds, like, I think it really engages you, creates some sort of element of anticipation.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I want to engage.
This page here has a lot of transformations. Like, clicking on one of these things takes you from point A to point B. We actually got rid of it, which I'm sad about, but clicking on this guy used to drop down a little thing, drop down a little drawer with our map that faded away the rest of the page, which looked really cool. It turned out not to test very well. People couldn't really find the contact or couldn't really understand what to do from there, so we created a separate page for that, which is not as fancy. But see the list, that little thing drops down, then it goes back up. This is very, very subtle, but there's this very, very quick fade in it doesn't actually immediately show up, but it takes like a very split second, this yellow to fade in. There's this guy. That's a rotation. That's actually, rather than a transition, it's an animation that keeps occurring. That's a completely separate thing. You can either do transitions or you can do an animation, which is essentially not transitioning from one thing to the other. It's simply iterating through, or just, yeah, looping through this keyframe animation that you can define. That's a separate thing. So if you want to look up CSS animation, look at an example. So this guy here, oh, slide in. I guess it doesn't loop. It doesn't have animation, but have a keyframe. Here we go. Animation iteration count. See, this is just going to go over and over. Yeah, my battery's going to die pretty soon, and it's also 9:45. So I'm going to say I probably don't have the time to cause that thing to happen on this page. But essentially, the idea is that instead of changing from show to hide, from display none to display flex, I simply make it so it changes from, let me do it really quick, 1 second. Let's see if I can do this and beat the time. Let's see, transform equals translate x 0. I'm gonna set display flex at all times. But here, transform translate x 100%. Oh, I'm sorry, that's actually backwards. So translate x 100%, translate x 0. And I'm also going to say transition transform 0.5s ease. And let's see what happens. There we go. Ta-da. Bam. And if I wanted to add a close button to get rid of that show nav thing, then I can have it move back off, right? Without any extra CSS. So it's simply changing the transform using a transition of 0.5s duration, and that's it. So that's what's going on. So that's just some new properties: transition, border radius, transform, flex, a whole bunch of new stuff that's newer in CSS. In addition to media queries and all this cool stuff, there's a whole bunch of other stuff out there which you can take a look at, but that pretty much encompasses the main stuff out there. So yeah. Important announcements. I am not holding my lab this week. I actually have a conflict because I'm going to be in Austin for OSCON, Open Source Convention, just talking about open source stuff in rainy, thundery, very hot Austin. Weird. So that'll be me this week. I will not have a class, not have a lab this Thursday, but I will be here next week for something. Let's see if I have time to actually see what next week's material is and try to remember what it is. Next week, I'm going to talk about, oh, right, this is good stuff, working from a mockup. So we worked from mockups in the previous class, the class before. The next time around, we're going to work from something that's actually really professional. Something like, hey, here's the actual thing, like a site that could go for an actual real site. We're going to use a lot of CSS3 on it. We're going to use Flex. We're going to use all the cool technologies and build it out the way that I would build it out if I were doing this. So that's going to happen for the next 2 weeks, working from professional mockup. I will be here next week, so Monday is the time to do it, but no lab this week. Yeah, so sorry I went a little long, but I'll commit this code up as usual. As usual, you can join the discussion lists to find out more about this class and learn about what's happening in future classes or NoiseBridge announce. You can also donate to NoiseBridge, because that's always appreciated, and that's about it. So thanks for coming. I'm going to stop for now, just so I don't go too long. If you have any questions, come on up to me later, but that's it. Thanks for coming.